Welcome to Novara Live. It's me again. I'm Michael Walker. I'm joined by Dalia Gebrial. Good to see you, Dalia.
Good to see you, Michael. I can't remember when the last time we did this was. It's been so long.
We've been separated. Someone high up decided we shouldn't be on the same show together. I'm not sure why, but it
Divide
is
and conquer.
wonderful to see you again. We've got lots coming up, as you would imagine. The Israel-Hamas ceasefire potentially faltering, although Donald Trump seems to be holding it together, which is surprising. We look into the Kafili by-election and why it might be more important than you think. Also, Novara Media's Simon Childs talks about a big report he's just published uncovering claims of sexism and harassment at a major trade union federation. Also, we'll end the show with a new, the launch of a new organisation, actually, investigating the military-industrial complex and its relation to climate change. If you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. And it's Thursday, which means I wouldn't usually be here, but I am. So I'm more than happy to read this out, because tomorrow morning, every one of you who signed up to our most popular newsletter, The Cortado, will get Ash's freshest take of the week delivered straight into your inbox. But that's not all. We've recently expanded The Cortado, and Novara's very own Stephen Meffman is taking the reins every Monday morning. So sign up today to make sure you don't miss either of them by heading to Novara Media/The Cortado, or by following the link in the chat or bio. The Israel-Hamas ceasefire in Gaza looks increasingly shaky, with Israel ramping up its threats to resume its assault on the enclave over what they say is a breach of the ceasefire by Hamas. The issue? Finding and returning the bodies of Israeli captives once held by Hamas. So since Monday, Hamas has returned at most 9 bodies of the 28 known deceased hostages in Gaza. 2 have still to be identified. In response, a spokesperson for Israel's Ministry of Defense said this on Wednesday night. If Hamas refuses to comply with the agreement, Israel, in coordination with the United States, will resume fighting and act to achieve a total defeat of Hamas, to change the reality in Gaza and achieve all the objectives of the war. Hamas, however, have said they've done as much as they can for now, posting this statement online. The resistance has fulfilled its commitment to the agreement by handing over all living Israeli prisoners in its custody, as well as the corpses it could access. As for the remaining corpses, it requires extensive efforts and special equipment for their retrieval and extraction. Speaking at a White House press conference last night, US President Donald Trump appeared to back that message.
What is your understanding of the pace of returning the deceased hostages? Are you pleased?
Well, they're looking for them. Absolutely. They're looking. So we have the living hostages all back. They returned some more today. It's a gruesome process. I almost hate to talk about it. But they're digging. They're actually digging. There are areas where they're digging and they're finding a lot of bodies. Then they have to separate the bodies. You wouldn't believe this. And some of those bodies have been in there a long time. And some of them are under rubble. They have to remove rubble. But there are graves, and some are in tunnels that died in tunnels that are way down under the earth.
Now, this seems a very clear admission that Israel's mass bombardment of Gaza, genocidal bombardment of Gaza, killed lots of Israeli hostages. So it seems like that should potentially be a bigger issue than it is. Hamas, meanwhile, has also accused Israel of breaching the ceasefire by killing 24 Palestinians since the truce began. And the Israeli government has not responded to that claim. But on Wednesday, Defense Minister Israel Katz posted this about Palestinians killed in the Strip. So he said, the IDF operates in accordance with directives and enforces a clear policy of preparedness along the Yellow Line, which includes over 50% of Gaza's territory. The enforcement policy is unequivocal for every violation and immediate response. Yesterday, terrorists who attempted to approach and cross were thwarted, and so it will be in the future as well. Now we know what Israel calls a terrorist, which is basically any man over the age of 13 or something, it tends to be what they classify as a terrorist when it comes to Gaza. And the US has downplayed the accusations being made from both sides. There's one issue, though, that Donald Trump has been unequivocal about. This was the president speaking on Tuesday night.
We have told them we want to disarm, and they will disarm. And if they don't disarm, we will disarm them. And it'll happen quickly and perhaps violently.
You say,
but they will disarm. Do you understand me?
yes, you say
Because
quickly.
everyone says, oh, well, they won't disarm. They will disarm. And I spoke to Hamas, and I said, you're going to disarm, right? Yes, sir, we're going to disarm. That's what they told me. They will disarm, or we will disarm them. Got it? Okay.
What is
next.
the deadline you're going to put on that? You say quickly, sir. Sir, you said quickly, but what is the deadline you're going to put on
A
that before you
reasonable
take
period of
action?
time, pretty quickly.
On Wednesday night, CNN asked Trump what would happen if Hamas refused to disarm, with the president giving this answer. I think about it. Israel will return to those streets as soon as I say the word. If Israel could go in and knock the crap out of them, they'd do that. I had to hold them back. I had it out with Bibi. So far, of course, Hamas has rejected the idea of disarmament. Obviously, lots of people asking why the genocidal state shouldn't also be disarmed. Dalia, what are your thoughts on this? The ceasefire, well, I mean, obviously 24 Palestinians killed by the Israelis. They say they're terrorists. I doubt they've provided any evidence. But beyond that, the ceasefire does seem to be holding, and Donald Trump doesn't seem to be giving in to the Israelis, looking for excuses to basically start the war again when it comes to these bodies. What do you make of it all?
I mean, we all expressed very understandable trepidation about this ceasefire because those of us who know our history know that it is never that simple. I think there is something very perverse about the US being positioned as some kind of mediator or power broker in a conflict between two sides, when in reality, what is happening is that the entire weight of the mightiest powers in the world have thrown everything they have at a starving population of 2 million people who have no recognized government, who have no recognized military, who have no recognized powers of advocacy. And that weight of the world, that weight of Israel, of course, is backed and in fact includes the US, who are armed to the teeth with what Trump was actually boasting in the Knesset, standing in front of an Israeli flag. He was boasting that we have weapons that people don't even know about that are lethal beyond our imagination. And not to mention that when it comes to this sort of so-called peace plan, which has absolutely no guardrails against further Israeli violence, despite the fact that historical precedent routinely shows that Israel breaks peace plans, it breaks agreements, it breaks ceasefires. It has nothing meaningful to say on occupation, on Palestinian statehood. All it really has to say is that Hamas should disarm and that Gaza should be governed by people who aren't Palestinians or who aren't trusted by the Palestinians living in Gaza. And so it is not a peace plan in any kind of meaningful sense because it doesn't contain within it resolution to the core issue here, which is Palestinian sovereignty and self-determination. Instead, it really functions as a temporary reduction in the scale of killing and detention by the Israeli state. And I say that it's temporary because there is kind of an inbuilt obsolescence into the agreement because it has no viable pathway to Palestinian sovereignty and people will not live under domination forever. And it has no guardrails against Israeli violation of the terms. And so within that context, to act like the primary threat to this peace plan, given everything that we know historically, and also given the details of this exact plan and the fact that it has no checks and balances within it to guard against further Israeli aggression and violations, within that context, the idea that the main threat to this is Hamas not disarming is completely ludicrous. But at the same time, it shows that the world is not serious about Palestinian sovereignty, and that at this point in history, people see, when I say people, I mean governments, people in powerful governments, believe that the fastest way to a resolution here is exhaustion of the Palestinian people. It's a Palestinian acceptance of either displacement or remaining in the land, but as second-class citizens within an Israeli state from the river to the sea. Because anyone who is not relying on that kind of outcome would not believe that this plan was serious. And it relies on Palestinian exhaustion when it comes to sovereignty and self-determination. And that is what is meant by peace here. Peace here is not resolution. It is silence. It is silence of the Palestinians. It is silence of people globally who consider themselves to be in solidarity with the Palestinians. And so it is not surprising to me that we are seeing Israel already, within days, already testing the boundaries of this so-called peace plan and showing to the Palestinians very clearly that this peace plan is not designed around resolution, sovereignty, self-determination. It's resolved around just sort of delaying the inevitability. What they want to construct is the inevitability of Palestinians accepting displacement or accepting to live as second-class citizens, because there is no pathway to anything otherwise. And that is why, when we talk about peace is a very loaded term here, because for a lot of people, peace is not resolution and justice. Peace is absence of conflict, or it is silence. And one quick route to silence is genocide or forced displacement or ethnic cleansing.
I suppose in the long term, you're sort of saying, I mean, I totally agree. This isn't a peace deal, because it doesn't have any route to Palestinian sovereignty. Of course, one way in which the Israelis have tried to prevent any sort of momentum building up towards Palestinian sovereignty is by taking out key leaders who might be able to unite the Palestinian people, which leads us to our next very much related story. While Israel agreed to release almost 2,000 Palestinian captives as part of the ceasefire, there was one prisoner they absolutely refused to hand over. Marwan Barghouti, sometimes described as Palestine's Nelson Mandela, is by far the state's most popular leader. He's been held in Israeli prisons for 23 years without ever having faced a fair trial. On Wednesday night, his son, Arab Barghouti, revealed what other released Palestinians had told him about the violence his father has recently suffered at the hands of Israel. So he said this: "What we know is that while they were transferring my father, they stopped along the way, and 8 security guards within the prison authority that worked for the prison authority started beating my father up in different ways, by kicking him, by throwing him on the ground, by punching him, focusing on the head area, chest area, and legs as well," he said, adding that his father later told fellow prisoners he lost consciousness as a result of the attack. The released detainees say that when he came to Megiddo, he could barely walk for days. Now, according to Arab Barghouti, Israel's Security Minister Ben-Gvir also showed the 66-year-old prisoner a picture of an electric chair and told him he deserved to be executed. So why is Israel so keen to keep Marwan Barghouti behind bars and far away from Palestinian politics? Well, last night, Arab Barghouti appeared on Channel 4 News, where he was asked what role his father might play in a Palestinian state were he released.
There is speculation or hope that there may be elections for the Palestinian Authority, Palestinian government, within the next year or so. I mean, is it your father's wish to contest those elections and to be released in time?
I will have to wait until I talk to him. I haven't talked to him in 3 years. I think that knowing him, in a few years ago, when we were supposed to have elections, he declared and announced that he will be running for president. And I think that this is an encouraging thing. You're talking about someone who's, again, trusted by the Palestinian people, and we haven't had a trusted leadership for a very long time. I think elections are very positive towards the Palestinian people and the Palestinian political system overall. We need more youth in power. We need more women participation in power. We need leadership that we actually trust. So it's not only about my father, but my father represents that voice that is reasonable by the Palestinian people. And I really hope, as someone who hasn't even voted before in my life, it's my dream that we have elections as soon as possible and we get to choose our leadership.
Barghouti was also asked more generally about Gaza.
Is he someone who could also reach out to the leaders in Gaza if he was allowed to communicate. Is he still effectively cut off at the moment?
Yes, he hasn't been able to. We haven't had any access to him in years. In 3 years, we haven't been able to talk to him as a family. But the lawyer has been able to see him only 5 or 6 times. And yes, I do think that he has the legitimacy and moral authority to be able to bring and build the bridges between all Palestinian factions and to have political partnership between all Palestinians. And unity has been always his political legacy. If you go back to the prisoner's document in 2006, he brought every single Palestinian faction, and until today, it's the only signed document by all Palestinian factions. And that stated clearly that the Palestinian state will be built on the 67 borders. Resistance should be limited to within the 67 borders, and the targeting of civilians should be forbidden. So he is someone who is capable of taking political initiatives that are reasonable, accepted by everyone, and that's exactly why this fascist government fears him.
And that's exactly why they won't release him. What's often frustrating is you hear people who are, supporters of the Israeli state, supporters of the Israeli government, who say, well, what can they do? They don't have anyone to negotiate with on the other side. It's either the Palestinian Authority, who don't really have any legitimacy because there haven't been elections in a very long time and they're seen as sort of stooges collaborating with Israel, or Hamas, who are all terrorists, according to the interlocutor. Now, Marwan Barghouti is someone who does seem, from the polling, from recent history, like someone who could unite the Palestinian people so that they're not divided between the PA in the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza. But that's obviously exactly what Israel don't want, because a united Palestinian people would create more pressure for a genuinely sovereign state. Of course, Britain and the majority of the UN has now recognized Palestine as being a state, but that doesn't mean it has in any way viable sovereignty. In the UK, one political party is calling for Marwan Barghouti's release. This was the Green Party's Ellie Chowns in Parliament, on Wednesday.
One of the Palestinian prisoners who has not been released is Mr. Marwan Barghouti, a member of the Palestinian Legislative Council who's been in prison since 2002 without a fair trial and subjected to human rights abuses. Can I ask the Prime Minister what recent representation his government has made in the last few days to secure the immediate release of Mr. Barghouti, given his widespread popularity as a unifying voice for Palestinian rights, dignity and freedom, and therefore his potential crucial role in securing a meaningful and lasting peace in the region? Sir.
Can I thank you for raising the individual case and offer to provide her with such further information as we can, as soon as we can, in relation to that particular case.
He won't even say his name in relation to that particular case. Sort of like Starmer as lawyer, sort of like, why not? Sort of, I suppose he says, well, maybe he's done some crimes in the past. I don't want to upset the Israel lobby, I suppose. Dalia, I mean, I have to say, I was not remotely surprised that Israel didn't release Marwan Barghouti. I do think it is very telling, though, that this is someone who, the most plausible candidate as to someone who could unite the Palestinian people to negotiate a two-state solution. I think Marwan Barghouti has explicitly backed a two-state solution, yet they will not release him.
Yeah, and it's worth mentioning as well that Marwan's name was on the list of prisoners to be part of the prisoner exchange, the list that was signed by the US, and Israel, in the middle of the night, as they often do, just sort of removed his name off the list without any explanation, despite the fact that was part of the agreement and a really important part of the agreement, and was part of the agreement that the US signed on to as well. So, Israel has no masters. It has no one it is accountable for, not even the US, because it is able to just sort of within hours essentially violate one of the most important parts of the agreement, which is the names on the prisoner list shortly after it was agreed. Over the past 2 years, a lot of people, particularly kind of liberals and others around the world, who have sort of just tuned in to the politics of the region, but for some reason think that they have the moral authority and the intellectual expertise to interpret the events of the region. They always would say this, this thing, where is the Palestinian Mandela? Where is the Palestinian Mandela? And the subtext of that is essentially that what is happening to the Palestinians is their fault because they chose a path of violence. They chose to not express their resistance in the way that we believe a deserving people should behave. Now, the answer to where is the Palestinian Mandela is the Palestinian Mandela is currently being tortured in an Israeli dungeon, and his name is Marwan Barghouti. And when we talk about Israeli prisons, when we talk about the kinds of conditions that someone like Marwan Barghouti will be in, we're not talking about prisons in a conventional sense. You know this about me, Michael. I believe that all prisons are dehumanizing places, but Israeli prisons that hold Palestinians are more like torture camps. They are essentially just these complete black holes that are ungoverned by any kind of legal norm or moral boundary. We are talking about systematic sexual, psychological, physical torture, no access to legal representation. Many of them, including Marwan Barghouti, have not had access to a fair trial. Some of them haven't had access to a trial at all. They have absolutely no connection to the outside world. We heard from Marwan Barghouti there that he has not spoken to his father in 3 years. It is torture for the people inside those prisons, and it is torture for their families and loved ones who are waiting outside of those prisons, knowing what their relatives and their loved ones are going through, because Palestinians have testimony from people who have been held in these camps, these essentially what are camps, and they know what goes on. And so they are sitting, waiting for the return of their loved ones, who they know with every passing day, their loved ones are going through the most unimaginable horrors. So it is an assault on the people inside the prison, and it is an assault on the people outside of the prison as well, on the whole Palestinian community. And I want to also come back to this notion of, Barghouti commonly being touted as the Palestinian Mandela. And of course, people retroactively remember Nelson Mandela as being kind of the idealized freedom fighter, when of course at the time he was, like the Palestinians in those prisons, considered to be a terrorist, not just by the apartheid regime, but also by our own governments. Thatcher and Reagan famously considered Nelson Mandela to be a terrorist. But the reason that Barghouti is called the Palestinian Mandela is for the reason that you outlined there, Michael, which is that he is one of the only, I would argue, the only figure that can unify Palestinians across the West Bank and Gaza, across the secular and Islamist divide, across the factions between those who believe in a particular kind of armed resistance and those who believe in the diplomatic process. He is one of the only people that could possibly lead a Palestinian state cohesively, a united Palestinian state, much like Nelson Mandela was viewed as a person who could feasibly lead a post-apartheid South Africa. Marwan Barghouti is understood to be someone who can lead a post-occupation Palestine. And this is at a moment where the Palestinians are incredibly divided by a systematic program of divide and rule by the Israeli occupation. And so his release and his ability to stand in elections represents a direct threat to the Israeli strategy of divide and rule when it comes to the Palestinians. But we have to remember that the freeing of Mandela, who could then be someone who could stand in elections and lead a post-apartheid South Africa, was the result of, it wasn't because of the benevolence of, the apartheid regime that he was released. It was because of a concerted and steadfast resistance movement within South Africa, and also the alienation and isolation of the apartheid regime by national governments around the world. Now, famously, the UK was one of the last to join that ship. But we eventually did. And that kind of global isolation was what caused the apartheid regime to fall, and for South Africa to have, the release of Mandela and then a future after apartheid. we aren't in that moment yet. And that is why we are in this situation. We are not at that moment yet where national governments around the world are willing to isolate Israel in order to have them create, in order for the conditions for a cohesive Palestinian state and sovereignty to emerge. I mean, we're in a position where Keir Starmer will not even say his name in parliament. So I think we can use that kind of that example both as a source of inspiration that, eventually Mandela was freed, and, Marwan Barghouti himself, who has, by the way, also led movements and led political consciousness from within jail. He has often talked about, I know that one day I will be free because of his faith and his steadfastness. But we also have to be very realistic about what kind of conditions need to be in place for that to happen, and how far our national governments are from being there. And it is our responsibility, of course, to push them to that point. Much like in South Africa, BDS is a really key part of that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that is kind of the only model that makes any sense, which is just mass international pressure on Israel to say you can't do this, and that will have to be led from the bottom up, as it was in South Africa. The International Transport Workers Federation, or ITF, is a global federation of transport unions across the world. It represents a total of 16 million workers across a range of national trade unions which are affiliated with its sort of an umbrella organisation. Now, in the UK, those affiliated organisations include the RMT, ASLEF, GMB and Unite. But a new investigation by Novara Media's Simon Childs has revealed that far from protecting workers' rights, the ITF appears to have a sordid history of sexual harassment, discrimination and cover-ups when it comes to its women employees. It's so bad, the union's leader was accused of heading up a sexist boys' club after he was accused of sexual harassment, with colleagues even jokingly calling him the Harvey Weinstein of the labour movement. Now, this is an in-depth investigation covering a wide range of allegations concerning what appeared to be an ingrained anti-woman culture in the union. We don't have time to cover all of it here. You can check out the article on our website. Some of the key parts, though, this is the account of one woman who worked in his office regarding alleged harassment. So this is a piece of the article regarding alleged harassment by the British head of the union, Stephen Cotton. And so it says this: in 2019, an IDF delegation travelled to the Vatican City for a summit with trade unions and manufacturers. Addressing the summit on the topic of modern-day slavery, Cotton said, "The IDF can commit to an ongoing dialogue between us, the Catholic Church, and the businesses in this room." Following the summit, having made his peace with God, according to a woman who worked in his office, Cotton forced himself into her hotel room. "To this day, I don't know how he got my room number," she said, "but he knocked on my door, then forced himself in late at night and wouldn't leave, despite repeated requests for him to leave at that time. When he came in, he just started screaming at me, telling me I was worthless, that I had never done anything of value for the ITF, that he had permission to fire me." The woman said Cotton left around 20 minutes. "I didn't think it's appropriate for anyone to come to your room, especially uninvited," the woman said. "There's a power dynamic. I'm a woman. This is late at night. If there was no pressing issue, it's just wholly inappropriate for him to come to my room." The ITF says Cotton denies that allegation. Other employees of the ITF gave Novara Media accounts of a climate that appears to have been exclusionary of women. This is from Simon's report. So it says, "The woman who worked in Cotton's office said delegates would end up in bars where sex workers frequent. It was pretty normal for us to end up in places like this after an official dinner or some function," she said. "It wasn't just one country. This happened in Panama and South Africa, the Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand. It was no secret that people were okay with this type of behavior. They knew it was happening. There were multiple occasions that I can attest to where we were at strip clubs where the ITF card was used to pay for a tab," she added. Earlier today, I was joined by Simon Childs, the journalist behind this report, and I began by asking him to outline who the International Transport Workers Federation are.
So the International Transport Workers Federation is a federation of transport worker unions. There are over 600 unions affiliated to it. It's truly international. It's headquartered in London, but it represents workers around the world. Novara Media viewers would have heard of the RMT, the TSSA. They're affiliated, and similar unions around the world are all affiliated to the ITF, and they claim to be the voice of 16 million workers. And they do negotiations that are kind of across the transport sector. They're particularly proud, for instance, of their involvement in ILO C190, which basically commits, it sets out what gender discrimination in the workplace is. And they're kind of operating at that level on a global level about workers' rights.
There are quite a lot of moving parts of this story. So you've got testimony from women who have come to you, confidential internal reports, accounts of how a union's woman officer had to leave the job over stress. How did the reporting of this fairly complicated story come together?
So we wrote about the ITF a couple of months ago. Their London offices are currently undergoing a redundancy process, which is about saving money. But concerns have been raised that the process is being used to get rid of basically anyone within the organization who stands up for workers at the ITF, or who's affiliated to the Unite branch, which organizes those workers. So the Unite branch found that 100% of its union activists were at risk of this redundancy, and they were calling that union busting. The ITF denied this, and they said that the redundancy process was ongoing. But we published those allegations, and shortly afterwards, people came forward and said, "You are not really scratching the surface." One element of that story was that early stage there were concerns that the redundancy process was going to affect women more, because the structure of the organization is that it's a lot of like men at the top and women at the bottom, and people at the bottom were getting laid off more. So there was already this like gendered aspect to the redundancy process. But yeah, people came forward and said that's not even the half of it, and came forward with some really concerning allegations about specific instances of harassment, and also about the culture more widely being a place where sexism is extremely normalized. People go to strip clubs and pay for it with the union's credit card, and also a more kind of general day-to-day grind of misogyny that kind of drives people a bit mad, because you're working for this union that proclaims to have values of equality and to do really great work on gender, which it does, like it certainly does. But then to be working in that environment whilst also existing in a really like sexist environment, like really drives people to be quite broken and traumatized.
I mean, there were a number of statements, weren't there, from the ITF, but one of them was, they said that pervasive misogyny and lack of accountability, or the pervasive misogyny and lack of accountability that exists in the transport industry will inevitably be reflected in the culture and governance of the ITF. Although they did say they're committed to changing that reality. But basically it's saying, yeah, I mean, this is a sexist industry and that's going to be reflected in the union. It's not a particularly impressive response, is it?
It wouldn't reassure me if I was someone who worked in the ITF, or a woman who was maybe thinking about working in the ITF. Yeah, I was quite shocked by that. If they had said the transport industry can be a misogynist place, and unfortunately that may have affected us, then okay. But they said inevitably, which suggests a kind of fatalistic view. Which is not very reassuring.
This isn't the first story that Novara Media have covered when it comes to sort of sexual harassment in trade unions. Is there a problem in the union movement with sexism and sexual harassment?
I think so. I think trade unions are no different to anywhere else. They're just as vulnerable to sexist and misogynistic work practices as anywhere else. Obviously, they do really important work. They are proven to improve outcomes for workers, but that doesn't mean that like misogyny just passed them by somehow. The trade union movement went through its own sort of Me Too type moment. This group called Me To You, which is obviously a take on Me Too, was set up in 2022. And yeah, there have been various allegations. I mean, the one that most obviously springs to mind is the TSSA. Its General Secretary, Manuel Cortez, had to resign. No, he didn't. No, he got dismissed for gross misconduct. And there was a report into that union that found that basically, yeah, there was a really misogynistic culture that had been facilitated by the leadership, who basically were more concerned about maintaining their own power base than dealing with any allegations of misogyny. And I would say that kind of dynamic appears to be what has played out at the ITF, where there have been acknowledgements that sexism is a problem, a lot of acknowledgements and a lot of attempts to change that, and a lot of, some quite strong statements from Steve Cotton, the General Secretary, saying we are going to change. And then what follows are concerns raised by the staff that those attempts are being undermined by attempts to make sure that the leadership are not actually held account for anything. So an example of that is there's a mutual respect policy, which the staff and the management were like thrashing out. And it collapsed because the staff wanted more reassurance that that policy would actually enable them to complain about the General Secretary himself in a way that would actually work and would actually have integrity. And they didn't get those reassurances, and so they voted against that policy that they had been working on. There is a policy, but it's one that the Unite branch voted against.
So lots of this story concerns this General Secretary, so Stephen Cotton. I assume he's still in post. Are there any demands? I mean, I suppose what's happening? What's the impact of this journalism? Are further investigations happening? Is there any pressure on some of the unions that people might have heard of to disaffiliate from this international federation? What's the status of how this is developing since being published?
So we published this last night. And I think, to be honest, it's a bit too early to say. There's a board meeting happening yesterday and today. And yeah, it's possible that there could be a push for some unions to disaffiliate. There could be calls for key officials to resign. But that's what could happen. I'm not saying that's happening. I guess I'll keep my eye on it and continue to report, but I've not heard directly that those things are happening yet.
That was Novara Media's Simon Child speaking to me earlier today. Now, the union has given a lengthy response to Simon's investigation, penned by current President Paddy Crumlin and incoming President Frank Murillo, obviously a different role to the General Secretary. I'm going to read that statement in full. So they say, "We recognise that the transport industry remains overwhelmingly male-dominated and poorly regulated, with systemic failures from both employers and regulatory bodies. Within this environment, misogyny, exploitation and racism have too often gone unchecked. The ITF is committed to changing that reality and is taking ongoing action to eliminate unacceptable behaviour. We accept that the pervasive misogyny and lack of accountability will inevitably be reflected in the culture and governance of the ITF. Our policies have long been focused on confronting the systemic failures within the industry that enable companies to evade accountability to their workforce, particularly women, and reinforce a culture where discrimination, the denial of rights, and the absence of basic employment protections are routine. We reject any other characterization of the ITF. By any measure, progress has been made to advance gender equality in the industry and within the governance of the ITF. The ITF takes these accusations seriously. Processes have been put in place to ensure that any employee or participant at ITF events can raise a complaint safely and confidentially through our mutual respect and independent reporting mechanisms. Individuals are held accountable for their actions regardless of their seniority. In response, the ITF Executive Board established an Affiliate Oversight Group, or AOG, composed of senior women leaders from across our global movement to hold the General Secretary and ITF leadership to account on gender equality matters. The AOG has appointed an independent consultant to review progress and make recommendations for further improvements. We are unable to comment on the details of any specific cases due to confidentiality and commitment to privacy. Any allegation of this nature are dealt with in a clear and transparent fashion. Cases will continue to be investigated rigorously and expeditiously and mediated and resolved as soon as practical. This has happened and will continue to be the focus of ITF policy. The broader historical claims put to us are selective and in many cases incorrect. They do not reflect the culture of the ITF today." If you want to read the full report, the link is in the description. Voters in the southern Welsh constituency of Caerphilly will go to the polls to vote in a Senedd by-election next week. And that's after the former MS, Labour's Hefin David, died suddenly last month. But this election is being seen as about more than simply choosing a new representative. Caerphilly, a post-industrial town just north of Cardiff, has been a Labour stronghold since the formation of the Welsh Assembly in the late 90s. In Westminster, it's returned a Labour MP at every election since its creation in 1918. But that could all be about to change. Current polling puts Reform UK's candidate in first place, with Plaid Cymru just 4 points behind, so on 42 and 38% respectively. Trailing way behind with just 12% of the vote is Labour. Now, that would be a devastating result for a party that's represented the region for over a century. There are other interesting details in the polling, though. 50% of voters aged 18 to 34 back Plaid. Meanwhile, Reform's strongest support comes from older voters, with 41% or 49% of the over 55s backing them. Which I suppose is unsurprising, really, that older people back Reform, younger people back Plaid. The right-wing party's rhetoric, though, so this is Reform, is also proving divisive. This is from BBC Debate among the candidates last night.
I asked the question about, is immigration a problem for Kafili? You started then going on about outside of Kafili. So I want you to answer my question as to whether it's a problem for Kafili.
But then, right, fine. Lady next.
Hi, I'm Cole's mother. I'm born and bred in Kafili. I've lived here all my life. And I have their father, my other son, is part of the 2.9% that you say are overtaking Kafili.
I haven't used that.
Right. Well, you're using that immigration is overtaking the country.
I haven't said that either.
We've lived here all our lives, and I have never felt so unwelcome in my own hometown as I do since your party came into Kafili with all the rhetoric that you bring in. I have to say to my sons, please don't go there, please don't do this. And quite frankly, Mr. Powell, I blame you for that.
Okay, clear cut.
I speak about immigration as a policy. Just like if I stand here and talk about...
We're not policies. You're talking
well,
about human beings.
It's a government policy.
You're talking about human beings.
Yes.
It's very disingenuous from Reform. I have to admit, I haven't been following this by-election particularly closely. I think next week we'll get on someone from that part of the world to discuss this. But I suppose in terms of Reform more generally and the comments of that gentleman and his mother from the audience, the idea that Reform are just talking about policy, right? No, we're not trying to demonize anyone. We're just talking about policy that we want to change. When week after week over the summer, you had Nigel Farage talking about essentially migrant crime, and all they ever talk about is migrants as if they're criminals, right? So that's not just a policy issue, is it? That's demonizing a whole group of people. Dalia, obviously Reform are ahead in the polls in this constituency, but also nationwide at the moment. Do you think that sort of the kind of pushback we heard there will become sort of louder and a bigger challenge to them? Or do you think that they think that sort of the silent majority will ultimately side with them?
I mean, I think that that's a question that I wish we were thinking about 10 years ago, because in many ways, Kafili is a microcosm of what is happening politically across the whole country and economically, which is a complete collapse of the centre. You have a borough that was formerly a mining borough where people gave their health, their lives to fuel the Industrial Revolution, to fuel the wealth of Britain, who were abandoned with the closing of the mines. And then you have like a short time where there was manufacturing, but then once again, they are abandoned. And so we have deindustrialization. And now, just as recently as October 2024, we had reports from Kafili of 10% of the council, of workers for the council, being made redundant because of what was called austerity on steroids. And that austerity on steroids not only caused significant job losses, it caused things like the closing of cultural venues, of cultural institutions, museums, the things that make life worth living. And that's not to mention also cutting into things like so the social support system, housing, education, and all of those things. So you have people who are completely abandoned, who should not, why should they continue to vote for the Labour Party? What has that delivered them in recent memory? You cannot rely on fear and, telling people that they have no other option. You can't rely on that forever. People don't accept that forever. At some point, people break. And so it's totally understandable to me that they would refuse to vote for Labour. Now, the problem is that over the past let's say 10 to 15 years, I would actually say maybe 20 years, as the disastrous fruits of neoliberalism and centrist politics have really taken hold and really been felt on a very acute level, and it has become very clear to people that centrist politics is running out of steam, the media and the state have made it impossible for anything other than a far-right alternative to capture that gap. Anytime there has been a left-wing political project, a political project that identifies the root economic cause of the problem, that calls for redistribution, that calls for a rewiring of our economic system, that is actually an inclusive economy and is not an economy that is concentrated in the hands of a very small number of people who are all located in London and involves the abandonment of the rest of the country, that those people have been demonized and pushed out of the possibility of ever being able to portray a political alternative. And yet, the far right, the Nigel Farages of the world, the reforms of the world have been relentlessly platformed and just basically have it had a level of platform that far outweighs any kind of democratic mandate they have ever had. I always like to say that in until the recent election, Nigel Farage had stood and failed to be elected in national elections in this country over and over again. He had been routinely rejected by the electorate, and yet the media continue to push him down our throats until he basically became the only representative of an alternative to centrist politics that people could draw on. And obviously, he articulates that through an anti-immigration politics, through a politics that is undeniably, in my view, racist. And so then people's frustration with the collapse of centrism becomes co-constituted with this idea of it's the fault of immigrants. It's the fault of migration. Migration is the reason that you don't have, cultural institutions and things to do on the weekend and after work and social spaces, cultural spaces. It's the reason you don't have jobs. It's the reason you don't have housing. It's the reason you don't have good healthcare. And so it's not surprising to me that at this point now, people will turn to the only alternative that they have been allowed to imagine. But of course, the reality is, as the woman in the audience pointed out, is that divisiveness and disruption is only going to get worse under a reform government. When I think about, especially, neighborhoods around me that have started to become hot points of, anti-migrant protest, we were living together fine until these agitators have come in and started to sow discord amongst our communities through that divisive racist politics. And it's not going to make people's lives better. Reform is not going to put more money and more funding into the services that actually make people's lives better. But people have not been able to imagine anything otherwise. And so Kafili is a kind of microcosm for what we are likely to see in 2029, which is, likely to be a reform victory, but also potentially having both main parties not making it into the top two. We've had a recent poll where the Greens have outperformed Labour for the first time in history. Now, in that poll, it also had the Tories as second. But my point being is that we might see a coalescing of the non-right, of the left, centre left, and further left vote around the Green Party. It might be and same in Scotland. We are probably going to see the SNP win in Scotland. We might see Plaid Cymru gaining in Wales. And so we might even see neither the opposition nor the party of government being one of the two main parties. And that is a kind of political reorientation that happens once every 100 years. But at this point, it's almost like, well, we can't just blame the people who are voting reform now, although I do think they need to take responsibility for the kind of society they are going to usher in by voting reform. But my blame primarily lies with the forces that over the past 20 years have made it impossible to imagine in a situation where it is clear that an alternative from the centre needs to emerge, there have been a series of forces, both within the state and within the media, that have made it impossible to imagine any other alternative other than the one that Farage offers us. Why? Because the alternative that Farage offers us does not actually challenge the powers that be. If anything, it enriches the private interests who want to get their hands and into our NHS. It enriches the private developers who want to abandon affordable housing at targets. It enriches all of the people who are going to become incredibly wealthy off a more complex, brutal immigration and policing system. So that is why any other alternative has been strangled. But what we can all agree on is that the status quo in places like Kafili have failed, and there is no reason why they should feel that they have to continue to vote for it.
That Kafili by-election is next Thursday, so we'll definitely cover that next week. The Senedd elections next year are going to be a really big deal because that could be when Labour completely collapse. And I suppose the two big parties it looks at the moment are going to be Plaid and Reform. I mean, it'd be interesting if Reform get into government and what effect that could have on the national elections when we have a general election. Although I have to say, you know, there's often been sort of moments, hasn't there, when the Tories have tried to attack Labour for how they've been in Welsh government, and those attacks often don't land because people in the rest of the UK people in England, let's say, tend to obsess about what goes on in England, not what goes on in Wales and Scotland. Once upon a time, in the late 2010s and early 2020s, European elites appeared to have found a new raison d'etre. Raison d'etre. I don't speak French. This was the continent that would lead the world economy into a new green economy.
The main point of this roadmap must be climate change. Indeed, the youth throughout Europe have been expressing this message. Our citizens also expressed the importance of climate change for them in the elections, and this has been the case for a number of years.
The European Green Deal is for the climate, but it's also for the people. And there's a huge transition ahead of us, and we have to invest in it to leave nobody behind.
To unlock that potential and protect our planet for future generations, I can announce today Labour's climate investment pledge. An additional £28 billion of capital investment in our country's green transition for each and every year of this decade.
My apologies. That wasn't the smoothest intro I've ever done, but that was Macron, von der Leyen and Rachel Reeves, all in the years between 2019 and 2021, saying how their big priority was going to be to invest tons and tons of money in a new green economy. Well, how times change. Of course, you'll know that pledge by Labour to invest £28 billion a year was dropped 3 years later. The EU's Green Deal is itself nowhere near reaching its €1 trillion investment goal, which is what von der Leyen had set out for it. And by June this year, campaigners warned that a rollback on EU environmental policy was gaining momentum. So, climate has taken a back seat in terms of European governance. But what has replaced it?
We are in an era of rearmament. And Europe is ready to massively boost its defense spending.
While we had planned to double the budget by 2030, we will double it by 2027. To this end, an update of the military programming law will be presented in autumn that will foresee the effort we will undertake until 2027 under my responsibility, and I am appealing to the responsibility of the nation.
I know that this House will endorse the principle of winning peace through strength. So starting today, I can announce this government will begin the biggest sustained increase in defence spending since the end of the Cold War.
Yes, we're rearming, baby. Of course, climate change isn't going anywhere. And in fact, the world seems to be heating up faster than scientists expected back in the heady days of 2019 and 2021. But events got in the way. There was a war in Ukraine, some modest electoral setbacks, especially in elections to the European Parliament, and Trump was returned to the White House. And now, investments in windmills and batteries are taking a backseat to armoured vehicles and precision munitions. Did it really have to be this way? A new research group has been set up to argue that it didn't and still doesn't need to. The Transition Security Project is tasked with investigating military-industrial complexes as economic, climate and geopolitical threats. And when I caught up earlier with the group's co-director, Khem Rogaly, and asked him what the project will do.
So the new project, Transition Security Project, is founded at a moment when military spending is at an all-time high. In Europe, most NATO countries have now committed to a completely arbitrary military spending target that commits them to basically doubling their military budgets over the next decade. And that includes here in the UK. We know at Transition Security Project that comes with massive economic, climate and geopolitical costs. We want to investigate these costs further. We want to shape the media narrative to ensure that they're properly understood. And we want to support organising, whether that's in trade unions or in national politics, to challenge this militarization of our societies.
Just to clarify, is military spending really at an all-time high? I suppose that my mental model is that it was very high during the Cold War, and the Cold War ended and it fell to much lower levels, and then Russia invaded Ukraine and now it's gone back up again. But my mental model didn't have it as at all-time highs, but I might be mistaken. If you could talk about that a bit more.
100%. So I think, as far as I know, the data that we have goes back to the Second World War, which is SIPRI, a Stockholm institute, basically, that collates it internationally. I think what you just said, though, captures one of the key narratives that we're here to kind of unpick and to challenge. Military spending in the UK, in real terms, is higher now than it was in 1980. One of the key moments of the Cold War. And actually, although it did come down a little bit in real terms in 1990, it soon increased and kind of overtook its Cold War levels during the War on Terror, and it's now at an even higher level. The same story is true in the US, where military spending is much, much higher in real terms than it was in that kind of peak Cold War moment. So really, the kind of idea that we had this peace dividend and we're now kind of returning to that is a bit of a myth. We had a huge period of militarization under the War on Terror, and now things are kind of even more extreme than they were before.
When you say real terms, you're talking about the absolute amount we're spending on the military, taking into account inflation. Another way of looking at it, isn't it, is a proportion of GDP. So as a proportion of GDP, I presume military spending's not at an all-time high, but you tell me.
Yes, exactly. So proportion of GDP in the UK, it's definitely come down since the Cold War. But the reason that they use the proportion of GDP figures, the reason NATO uses that, is because it obscures the actual amount that you spend. So if you look at the latest commitment, European governments have signed up to spending 5% of their GDP on what they call military and associated investments. So 3.5% on their militaries, an additional 1.5% on these as yet undefined security-related investments. That is a doubling of where lots of them are at now. In the UK context, if you look at GDP forecasts, if you look at SIPRI's analysis of this, it's looking like £75 billion extra per year by 2035. This is a massive, massive amount of money in the current economic context of the UK. And to be honest, the government don't really have a plan of where they're going to get that money from, what that spending is going to consist of. They've just signed up to this GDP figure because the GDP figure is set as a kind of geopolitical posture by NATO rather than anything to do with military need, security need, or the kind of economic necessities of the time that they commit to it.
Your argument is that there's a strong sort of intersection between militarization and climate change. I suppose there's two mechanisms, isn't there? So sort of one, that the investments we make in the military, we could instead make in mitigating climate change, a sort of opportunity cost. And the other is the direct emissions that come from the military. I suppose, is that in the production of military equipment or that equipment being used when fighting wars? I suppose, talk to me about the relationship as you understand it between militarization and climate change.
So this is an often hidden relationship, actually, because the Pentagon, and it's well documented, lobbied to get military emissions removed from the Kyoto Protocol in 1997 because they were so concerned that international climate agreements could restrict their operations. And that's because militaries are a huge and hidden source of emissions. Globally, they represent about 5.5% of all greenhouse gas emissions. So that's double civilian aviation and civilian shipping combined. And really, the source of those emissions is partly in production, the production of weapons that we're now going to see at a massive scale in Europe, in the UK, and obviously more and more in the United States, but also, and I would say primarily, in the operation. So you think of the US military, you think of 750 bases across the world, kind of global behemoth. But often people talk about the UK military as if it's this kind of little minnow that's been gutted over the last few years and is now kind of returning to strength. It's not the case at all. It's also got these bases everywhere across the world. It's obviously well-equipped interventions, as we saw, well-equipped to do horrific military interventions overseas, as we saw in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and elsewhere. So all of those interventions, all of that kind of overseas infrastructure has a big emissions effect. You know, you're moving people, you're moving weapons all across the world. So, for instance, if you look at the emissions from the genocide in Gaza, which for me is not really an important effect of a genocide, but it tells you a lot about how militaries actually work. And the emissions come from the Israeli fighter jets. They come from the massive movement of US weapons, of European weapons to Israel. That's where the kind of the predominant source of these emissions comes from.
And this turn to militarism, or this turn to rearmament, let's say, because it's very clear that there was a moment, I suppose, in the early 2020s when it seemed like sort of the state project of the EU, even Britain, in America under Joe Biden, was sort of, let's invest in a new green economy. That was sort of very much in vogue. That's very much been put on the back foot, and people are now saying, okay, that's going to have to wait. Defense comes first. What's your analysis of why that decision has been made? Is it a mistake on the part of elites? They think that Russia is more threatening than you believe Russia is. Do you think this is the military-industrial complex, or an opportunity and sort of took advantage of it? What's your analysis of why that shift happened?
So I think there's a combination of those factors, but really the kind of way that I would distill it is that what they're not saying is defense comes first. What they're actually saying is that geopolitics comes first. And really this is an attempt of the US in its rivalry with China to lean on the kind of remaining strategic advantage that it has. You know, it's not going to supersede China as a green industrial powerhouse. It's not going to defeat China as a kind of economic productive engine. What it does have is obviously financial strength with the dollar, but it has military strength. So it's leaning into its military strength. And the reason that we're seeing this in Europe is because it's being demanded by the US as a kind of sign of loyalty to NATO and to the White House. So as I kind of explained earlier, that new spending target, it comes directly from the US. It's not based on any assessment of how many weapons do we need, what do our militaries need for kind of national or regional defense. It is purely the exact amount that the Pentagon spends as a percent of GDP. So it's 3.5% on militaries. That's what the Pentagon spends. That's what the Europeans have been forced to sign up for. So really from a kind of European perspective, what they've gone for kind of in that Cold War, in that great power rivalry, is to sign up with their kind of full loyalty and allegiance to the US, to say, you know, we don't want to lose this partnership. We're going to sacrifice those green investments. We're going to sacrifice social spending. What we believe is most important is kind of demonstrating our allegiance to the White House.
And I suppose when it comes to Ukraine, because for whatever reason, that does seem to have been part of the turning point, especially when it comes to European rearmament, maybe less so when it comes to the United States. But there was an analysis that the European or Western Europe or the EU powers got a bit caught off guard, and that actually they weren't particularly well equipped to provide Ukraine with what it needed to defend itself, particularly in terms of the production of military equipment and artillery and the like. So Russia, I mean, basically proved to be more capable at that than the rest of Europe. Was there a problem there? Do you think that there was a sense in which the Europeans got caught off guard, or do you just think that's sort of the wrong track to be going down? What's your take on that?
So actually, if you look at the spending, it becomes very clear that they weren't caught off guard, because it's really the decade between 2014 and 2024 that you see this massive surge in European military spending. It didn't start with the land invasion of Ukraine. It started a long time before then. And basically what you see is that European NATO countries, actually specifically in Central and Western Europe, so not Eastern European countries that might have that kind of greater proximity to Russia and kind of feel the effects of that rivalry more, their spending has doubled over that decade between 2014 and 2024, even in Central and Western Europe. It's not just doubled, they've also doubled their arms imports from the US. So kind of across that whole period, they were still spending huge amounts of money on their militaries. They were importing loads of weapons. It didn't stave off the invasion of Ukraine and that conflict. And obviously that conflict has come with massive human cost as well. It's absolutely devastating, and solutions do need to be found to it. But I think the real idea here is not that kind of Europeans have started rearming as of 2022 in response to that invasion. It's a process that's been going on for a longer time. And if you look at the roots of it, obviously there are kind of moments of Russian expansion that were happening. But really there was also a lot of pressure starting from the Obama era White House, basically on the Europeans to up their military spending. As I say, in that kind of strategic battle that we have going on between the US and China, the US wants to kind of showcase both its own military power and to increase the military power of its allies. So it's been pressuring European governments from that moment in 2014 until now, where you get those leaked messages from White House officials saying that Europeans should pay for the US to bomb Yemen, for instance. I mean, the UK was bombing Yemen for a year over the last year just to show its support to the US and to Israel.
And I mean, NATO is partly back on the agenda on the left. Zach Polanski from the Greens has said sort of he has a long-term ambition to leave NATO. He said there'd need to be some kind of independent allied European force beforehand. Zara Sultana, I suppose, has outflanked him and said that she thinks it should be a red line that the UK immediately leaves NATO. Is that the kind of analysis you would have? Do you think that the UK would need to immediately leave NATO to reduce military spending, or could we just say to the US, yeah, we'll stay in NATO as long as you'll have us, but we're not spending whatever it is, 5% of GDP on the military?
Well, I think it depends how you'd want it to play out politically. You could certainly do the latter. I mean, Spain, for instance, resisted the military spending target. They asked for the climate crisis to be treated as a security threat. And they actually used their military not as a kind of military force in some context, but they have divisions that are focused entirely on disaster relief and aren't also fighting forces at the same time. So there are ways that kind of spending target can be either resisted or be reshaped. I mean, the UK has taken the most extreme strategy possible in trying to not just be the kind of loyal figure to the US and Europe, but trying to lead the process of European rearmament along with France and Germany. So I think that there's a kind of variety of options on the table for Zara and for Zach to resist that. I would say, though, that I think for me, there's a kind of a way that they can be caught in the trap here on questions like, should we abolish Trident or should we leave NATO? Those aren't the political choices that they would be making. Obviously, both of them are very far from electoral power at the moment. So the idea to say kind of day one in government feels a bit ridiculous anyway. But say it was day one in government, those aren't the choices that they're going to be making. I think the choice that they should be making is a much more strategic one, which is pursuing a strategy of non-alignment from the US, de-aligning ourselves from the US empire, closing overseas bases like on Cyprus, which the US uses to surveil Gaza and move military material to Israel, close our base on Diego Garcia, which was potentially going to have been used as a launching pad to bomb Iran, to reduce military spending and to look at a defense strategy that is actually about national defense and rather than about this kind of loyalty to the US. So to come up with a new spending target it would inevitably be lower, but it's thinking about our military as a defensive force and using the rest of the spending that we have there as a means of ensuring the everyday security of our citizens, whether that's security in climate crisis, but also healthcare, housing, schools, hospitals, the key elements of our everyday lives that we need security in. That's how I would be thinking about it, rather than kind of these kind of quite strange questions in some ways, or at least questions that oversimplify the matter to, do you leave NATO or do you abolish Trident on day one?
That was Khem Rogaly, co-director of Transition Security Project, speaking to me earlier today. You can find their work at transitionsecurity.org. And that's it for us today. My thank you to Dalia Gebrial. And we'll be back tomorrow at 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.